Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to Madrid platform in the beautiful Palacio de Cibeles in the heart of Madrid. Good morning if you're in Latin America. Good afternoon in Spain. If you're listening to us from home, and you can use our hashtag to tweet and ask questions through the platform. Now we're going to start our afternoon session with an interesting discussion which is essential to understand the economic and socio-political context to invest in Latin America. And here we have two very well-known figures who are expert in the subject. So first of all, for the socio-political aspect, we have Ramón Jáuregui, who is the president of the Fundación Euro-America and a member of the European Parliament and the vice president of Eurolat. And to give us the economic aspects, we have a very prestigious economist here, Germán Ríos, who is a specialist in macro and microeconomics in the IE University and a visiting professor at other universities. He's worked for the World Bank in the CAF, which is the Development Bank for Latin America, and he works for the George Washington University. So, Ramón, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Marta. Good afternoon for those of you in Spain. Hello if you're in Latin America. I'm delighted to be here on this platform and in this bridge, which we're creating with two economic markets, focusing on investment and looking at the advantages and the opportunities of economic investment in Latin America. First thing I'd like to say is that if we look at the socio-political features, as I was asked, is that we need to clarify that when we talk about Latin America, we are dealing with a lot of different countries, and we can make generalizations, but we need to take into account the idiosyncrasies and the individual features of each country. However, if we look at what could be shared features, objective shared features of the countries in Latin America, I would highlight a sort of black and white snapshot, if you want, to give an outline and quite an understandable portrait. So first of all, I'm going to talk about four of the black features of Latin America, and then the white side, the positive aspects. So if we start with the downsides, in general, these are fairly weak states with democracies that could be improved. There have been many issues with the functioning of these democracies, inadequate public services, as a result of the tax revenue for the state, because the funds that the state has to work with are fairly low. And indeed, the tax coverage in Latin America turns at around 20%. I think Guatemala is around 13, for example, and the average is much lower than that of the European countries. And so this means that states have a limited capacity to be able to provide services and to fight inequality, which means that in the political scenarios, there is a very wide inequality. So that's one of the first issues. So we have weak public services, inadequate public services, great inequality. The second negative feature is what I would describe as political and social instability that's reasonably high. If we look just today at the conflicts in Colombia, the problems in Chile, the elections in Peru, with huge uncertainty, what's just happened in Ecuador and in Bolivia. There's a social instability, middle classes, which has grown in the last 20 years as a consequence of the economic development in these countries, and this has created middle classes which today are demanding services which these weak states are unable to provide. And this creates conflicts. And the other thing I'd like to highlight is the regional fracture. There's too much division in Latin America. I am again going to say that there's things that could be improved in the political scenario. There's little physical connections or technological connections. And so when we talk about regional integration, there is a huge potential there, but it isn't in place. This is a region with many shared features, but it's very politically, technologically, and socially divided. And then to conclude my portrait of these 4 points, is an old-fashioned political discourse. If we talk about the political discourse and the political discussions that we've had in these recent elections in the countries that I've just mentioned, these discussions are outdated. We're talking about corruption, about democracy, about abortion. These are these are issues that have been resolved elsewhere in the world. We're in the 21st century, and this is the time in which the country should be moving now. We need to be connected with global competitiveness. And this discussion, unfortunately, is very infrequent at the moment in Latin America. But now let me give you some of the positives, the attractive features of Latin America, because this is also very important. And before German talks about the economic aspects, I'd like to just mention that there are very attractive political features. They're very attractive. And one is the whole of Latin America subscribes to the Western political vision. And this is the prism in which these countries operate. And that is important because this increases the probability that its development will happen within what we would call liberal democracies, protecting rights, protecting aspirations, and in the last 60 years, we have created advanced liberal democracies. That is one of the first positive features, and we mustn't forget that the democracy in Latin America has been consolidated in a very interesting way, where there have been some very complex processes with urban guerrilla movements, political conflicts, fights for equality. But by the end of the 20th century, Latin American countries had made huge and irreversible steps towards progress. Now, there's still some well-known areas of political conflict, and which build on issues that are typical in Latin America. We have 3 countries that stand out here: Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba. And then there's other countries that have other problems, lack of insecurity, lots of violence, drug trafficking. Now, secondly, the societies in Latin America are much more advanced than people think. These are societies where this modernity that we've talked about in the last 20 years, this economic development, has meant that there is great technological context in Latin America, for example, and this has been essential through the pandemic, because with education, for example, they were able to build on this technological development. There's also reasonably high levels of education. There are elites that are very present and allow the countries to be very competitive. Thirdly, there is huge capitalization on the future because there is a very attractive perspective for its potential in education, potential in the development of the middle classes, and in the fact that they're connected with a shared language. 20 or so countries, with the exception of Brazil, which share a language with a very similar root to Castellano, to Spanish, Spanish. And this helps with relationships, with trade. And as you said earlier, this gives us a universal conception of democracy, of values, of legal systems, political systems. They may be more or less stable, but it's very easy to build these connections because it gives access to very broad markets, and there's a huge potential for integration, which has not yet taken place, but I think it will, because a single market in this region is a huge asset. It has huge potential. It's exactly the same as when we built the single market in Europe after the Second World War. And this is the biggest asset that we have when we're negotiating with the rest of the world, and the same applies to Latin America. The problem is the cost that they're paying at the moment of the lack of integration. And a single market would be hugely interesting from an economic point of view. And also, the fourth point is the natural resources. It's the richest region of the world. They have energy potentials. We're talking about the transition, for example, the energy transition. Well, Latin America has huge potential there. And I think this is the point that I'd like to end with. In Latin America, they have a very interesting geography, and this offers a very interesting potential for investors. And this was the case at the end of the previous century, in the 1990s until 2000, when many companies, many European, Spanish companies, went to Latin America, modernized their public services, and they brought to Latin America a huge amount of progress and an increase in competitiveness. And despite everything that we've just said, I think it's objective and sincere to say that there is a huge potential for development in Latin America, and that's why, not just for political or cultural reasons or for harmony between its populations, but because it really has huge potential, and therefore, for all those reasons, Latin America is a very attractive prospect. Thank you very much for this sweeping overview that you've just given us in 10 minutes. And we keep these 4 strong points and then these 4 weaker aspects. And maybe that the 4 black sides or downsides will become a lot weaker over time. And now, German, it's your turn. I'm going to be objective. I'm going to do as we did before. I'm going to give the bad news first and then try and give some reasons for hope. And if you're investing in Latin America, why is this a good time or a bad time? Now, Latin America is very important in the global market. We have about 6% of the global GDP. It's an interesting market. We have interesting countries like Brazil and Mexico, which have great potential. As Ramon said, the question of the language is very important. 777 million people speak Spanish in Latin America, and even in Brazil, the second most popular foreign language spoken in Brazil is Spanish after English. And it's sure that in the first 400 years, Latin America managed to reduce poverty by half. It fell to 26% of the population lived in poverty. But then after the Second World War, then the situation started to get complicated, and the pandemic hit Latin America at the worst possible time. And these questions that Ramon just mentioned, talking about the democratic structure and other structural problems that we have in the region, such as the high level of informal economy, this means that the impact of the pandemic has been disproportionate. And that's why 16% of all of the infections in the world were in Latin America and 30% of all the deaths. And this has been due to some of the weaknesses in the public services in preparing for the pandemic. However, economically, things have been very important. Latin America is a region which depends on commodities. This is countries that are used to seeing sharp changes in their fortunes, booms and crashes. And when the pandemic hit and all the Chinese factories closed, then this had a huge impact on Latin America, which supplied a lot of commodities to the Chinese factories. However, other shocks that have hit the region also come from the pandemic. Look at the countries of Central America and the Caribbean were impacted with tourism. In the Caribbean, 80% of the GDP comes from tourism. These countries in the Caribbean are suffering terribly. Or we're talking about Mexico, Panama, where tourism represents more than 10% of GDP as well. But the other impact comes from remittances, because all the immigrants that are living in Europe and the US at the beginning of the pandemic, when things were going bad there, they were unable to send remittances back to their countries. And these remittances out from the diaspora are enormously important. Think of Venezuela, Ecuador. This was a huge financial source, and it suddenly came to an end. And then the impact of all of the lockdowns. We know these effects were very negative. And in mega cities like Sao Paulo with 20 million people, Buenos Aires, these mega cities, is that there's huge amounts of an informal economy, and people have had to go out to work. And so it's been very difficult to control the pandemic there. Now, I finished with the bad side. Now I'm going to go on to the good side. Now, I think we're on the fourth wave here in Spain, but I think there we are on the second wave of the pandemic in Latin America. But countries like Chile, Brazil, and Colombia are doing quite well, and there is a wider supply of vaccines in Latin America, because they have access to the Russian and the Chinese vaccines as well, rather than the ones we have here in Europe, or as well as the ones we have here in Europe. So, good news now. I think that one of the things that the crisis has shown is that Latin America has learned how to deal with external shocks. Latin American countries now have reflexive currencies. They have fiscal measures that they were able to put in place to help families, to help small businesses, in order to alleviate some of the impact of the pandemic. And another important theme, and I agree with you, that although the democracies are imperfect, if we look at the indicators of democracy around the world, Latin America is the most democratic region in the world after the US and Europe. And it's true that some of the institutions could be improved, but there's two aspects of Latin American democracy where we actually are leading the world. One is participation of women in politics. There's the greatest representation of women in parliament in Latin America after Europe. And the number of Latin Americans that vote. Turnout is more than 60%. It's one of the highest in the world. So there are things that can be improved, but some of the aspects of democracy are working pretty well. Another thing that I think is very important and a huge advantage for Latin America is the number of students that we have registered in higher education. It's at a record level, and we have had a demographic boom. The average age in the region is 32 years, and huge amounts of students are now being trained in universities. And then the other thing, commodities, raw materials. And I'm going to talk about this a bit more. If we have raw materials and commodities, it doesn't mean that we're necessarily rich. What we are hearing at the moment is green processing, circular economies, reducing CO2 emissions, and all of this requires raw materials. Let me give you some examples. If you want to bring your fleet if you want all of your fleet of cars or lorries to be electric vehicles, you need lithium, and 95% of lithium is in Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia for lithium batteries. And if you want to fight against climate change, we have the biodiversity. 50% of the world's biodiversity is in Latin America. Nobody can think about reducing global warming if it doesn't include Latin America. We have the Amazon region. I think that with the right policies and with international cooperation, the continent has an enormous potential to take advantage of both of these aspects. And there are countries of Latin America that stand out. I lived in Uruguay for a couple of years. It was impressive to say that 95% of Uruguay's electricity came from clean sources, and they did this because their policies wanted this. And almost all countries in Latin America could do this because they have wind, they have sun, and they have the water resources to be able to generate their electricity cleanly. And now, if I conclude by talking about commodity prices, I think commodity prices are going to be increasing, and that's also why Latin America will be the future. I'm just going to give you two factors. By moving to buy online, the demand for lorries, the demand for infrastructures, and logisticians will increase. And I'm sure that all of you who have businesses will note that your suppliers are raising prices because of the cost of containers. And now if we talk about raw materials, cement, steel, and lithium, for example, or cobalt, for example. If you remember the period from 2004 to 2014, the problem in commodities was caused by the growth of China, which was growing at a hugely fast rate. And they started to eat better in China. People started to eat better. They wanted Brazilian meat. And they wanted soya from Argentina. Now, if we think about India, with 1.5 billion people and most of the population under the age of 35, and they're growing faster than any other country in the world. And so I think that here we will have another commodity boom in the medium to short term. And this gives us business opportunities, which is what I can see in Latin America. Spanish, for example. Imagine if we had to start our digital transformation, because not everybody is online. This means training people. This means digitalization. Which country speaks Spanish and which could help Latin America? Well, it's Spain, obviously. This is the country that could be a huge opportunity. That's where the investment opportunities are. So, another sector that I think is the future of Latin America. I'm talking about clean energy. I've talked about digital. I'm talking about
son empresas hoy en día valoradas en más de $1.000 millones y todas o casi todas vienen del área de tecnología celular y de tecnología.
Cellular technology and fintech is the next big sector. There's a huge potential here. Clean energy, infrastructure, private investment, light manufacturing, the relocalization of production which used to take place in China in order to have a diversification of suppliers. And so I think that that's why it's a good moment to invest in Latin America. There's been a lot of pain, but I think that Latin America is now a very important area for investment in the future.
Thank you, Herman. It's amazing how much information you've provided us during this 10 minutes each. You both said the same. Latin America is the future because it has a lot to do and a lot of potential in resources. So we are seeing a clear view of something that can move forward, and that's exactly what this type of forum is for, so we can see in what way we can promote these processes. I just got a question. I would like to encourage everyone in the room to make any questions you may want. I have a question for both of you. Which do you think is the role of the EU in the recovery of Latin America? Will we be able to have soon an alignment of the US and the EU to solve the issues of the region? I believe it's quite relevant to find that triangulation for the US and the EU to have a common policy in order to solve some of the key issues in the area. Political issues, for instance. I think it's very important. The Biden administration could return to a much more constructive attitude towards Cuba, as Obama did during his presidency. That was completely broken by Mr. Trump. Europe, that already has an association agreement with Cuba, could help for an economic transition that is direly needed. After an economic transition, there's an technological opening that is critical. I believe that's the path. It's only the Cubans who have the right to decide, and they're the only ones who can actually do it. We could say the same thing for Venezuela. Europe should raise their awareness of how key Latin America is, for all of the reasons that German mentioned before, but also because it's constantly in the geopolitical radar. It's not easy for a Finnish citizen or a Lithuanian citizen to look into that. They're looking into closer markets or their conflictive regions. Well, if we're talking about international geopolitics, Latin America is a loyal friend of Europe. It's the most important space where we can make the presence and the defense of the values of Europe in the world. Herman, I would like to say that the main trade partners for Latin America are China and the US. And I'm basically saying everything here because we're in the midst of a trade war. But the main investor in Latin America is the US, and the second most important investor in Latin America is Spain. Spain is the entry door to Europe. And the multi-Latina companies are investing abroad their borders, are investing first in the US and in Europe after, but their favorite destination is Spain. Regarding the potential, it's no secret. Many people are aware of this. In the last few months, we've seen a huge movement of Chinese investors in many of the sectors that I mentioned before. They have bought electrical companies in Chile, they're investing in commodities in Argentina, they're even investing in Mexico that was never a potential market for them. I see a risk for Europe, for Spain there.
sumado a la diplomacia de las vacunas,
those Chinese
empieza a quitarle
investments,
espacio a
together
otros
with the
jugadores.
diplomacy
Por
of
eso creo
the
que
vaccines,
no hay que perder eso de
can
vista,
take
que hay que
away
actuar
space from
decisivamente
Spain.
y seguir España como ha
So
sido
Spain
siempre el
should be,
principal
as they've
impulsor de los
always
intereses
been,
europeos en
the
nuestro mundo.
main promoter of European interest in our region. Any questions from the public? 1 second, because they're going to bring the mic to you, because otherwise no one at home will be able to listen to you. I have a few questions, so if you don't have any questions, I have a lot of them in my pocket.
Bueno, gracias. Un saludo afectuoso a
Thank you, and I would like to say hello to Germán, who is a great friend of Latin America. My name is Boris Mejías. I'm the trade advisor for Ecuador.
Les he escuchado con atención sobre los pros y contras de América Latina.
I listen closely to the pros and cons of Latin America. I think there are more pros than cons. However, I would like to hear about your perspective regarding the relationship between Latin America and Europe in the near future. Understanding, of course, that we're in difficult context, post-pandemic. In Ecuador is very complicated. We are still in a lockdown. In what way do you think that Europe will be able to help this reactivation or this economic recovery for Latin America, especially for small economies such as the Ecuadorian economy? I know Germán knows very well the situation of our dollarized economy that doesn't allow us a lot of room to move. Well, Germán has said it before, but I will add to that improvement of relationships. We need to intensify the trade agreements between Europe and Latin America. We have a map of agreements with the whole of Latin America except Mercosur, as you know. In the case of Ecuador, we have a multi-party agreement with Ecuador and Peru, a very relevant and important agreement. I worked very closely to get Ecuador to be part of the multi-party agreement with Colombia and Peru. Allow me to tell you that there's something we need to do in Europe, but especially in Spain, is to eliminate the visa for Ecuadorians. We have 500,000 Ecuadorians working and living in Spain, a little bit less than that. And we're demanding a visa from them to get into Europe, into Spain as well. But the requirement is European. But this is completely unfair. We have many work ahead. Some of them are prioritary, such as the visa one. The others, to finalize the trade agreements, the economical agreements with Latin America, we need to renew a 20-year-old agreement with Mexico. Same thing happens on the Chile case, but mainly we need to sign and reaffirm the agreement with Mercosur. This is key for Europe and for Spain. And for all of these relationships that are demanding from us to improve, well, the framework is to improve the economic and the administrative difficulties in between our countries.
Yo solo agregaría que yo pienso que algo que ha anunciado el
I
gobierno
would
de
like
España,
to
que
add
creo que
that
es muy
something that
importante
the
y
Spanish
que tal vez
government
no se le ha dado
recently
la importancia
announced that wasn't
adecuada,
given
es
the
el apoyo que el gobierno
importance
piensa
it
dar
had
en el proceso de vacunación a los países de América Latina.
is the support that the government
Obviamente, hay primero
of
que
Spain is
terminar
going
la
to
tarea acá,
provide
pero eso
the
creo que va a
governments
ser
of
una
Latin
ayuda
America.
importante,
There's a lot of
porque si
work
no
to
resolvemos lo
be done,
sanitario,
but
mal
this is
vamos a poder resolver lo económico.
a
Y lo
priority
segundo,
thing.
Boris,
If we
yo creo
don't
que,
solve
la mejor
the
manera de España y
health
Europa de ayudar a
side, we won't be
países
able
como el
to
Ecuador,
improve
países pequeños,
the
es
economic
abriendo sus
conditions.
mercados, por ejemplo, en el caso
The
del
best way
banano,
is to
y otros commodities
open
que son
up their
importantes para
markets.
ustedes,
For instance, the case of
en esos
the
sectores donde hay potencial,
banano,
como el banano, como el camarón, como el petróleo, y
big
tantos
shrimp,
otros,
oil,
la biodiversidad del Ecuador,
the
etcétera,
biodiversity
que
of
todo lo que yo
Ecuador,
mencioné sobre los potenciales de
everything that I
América
mentioned
Latina,
about the
ustedes
potential
lo
in
tienen.
Latin
Yo creo
America,
que
you
eso es
have
fundamental.
all of those things.
Muchas de las que tomamos aquí son conservas de Ecuador.
Many of the tin food we eat here comes from Ecuador. We have time for one more question. I'm going to do it. We're talking a lot about investment. We want European investment to go into Latin America, But also, from an economic perspective, through investment, you can solve only one part. But how can we solve other issues that need to be done at the democratic level, social level? What is the role that the companies and the European countries can do? Well, companies don't have a role in the democratic advancement of countries. Companies can take on projects for countries. If a country is following a path into a green transition, they're demanding companies that have expertise and capacity. Well, that's collaborating with a country. And this is in the DNA of the relationship between companies and countries. Companies are sometimes perceived as companies that belong, and they feel appreciated by the people because they're committed to cover certain needs that the countries have. But us, the countries, European policy has a lot to offer by transferring their expertise without paternalism, helping in democratic building in cross-border policies, in regional integration. We've walked a wonderful path in Europe. We've built supranational laws. We're something in the world. We have a role because we are together. Latin America could do the same thing. What should Europe do? Well, we should offer our expertise to help towards the development. That should be done by the countries themselves. No one is going to be able to do anything. No one is going to impose regime changes to anyone. But what Europe can do is build bridges to be able to connect civil society, political society, to allow this transformation to happen. I will add that companies have a role to fulfill, not so much in democracy, but in strengthening certain institutions. If you're a foreign investor, and you go into a country and you comply with the laws and build their capacities, you bring technologies, you bring training for the working force, you're helping to strengthen key aspects for investment. And something that Ramon mentioned before is key, the free trade agreements, the renewal of those agreements. Mercosur and the European Union are wonderful mechanisms to improve institutions. Once you sign those agreements, you commit to complying with certain rules and regulations so that things can work out. That's a way to improve the situation. Post-pandemic, the social situation will be complicated, and companies need to help civil society and to improve living conditions. Any further questions from the public? No? I know what you're doing because this is riveting. And I'm very sorry because we're out of time, because I will be 4 hours listening to you, because your perspectives are realistic. You're not being too optimistic. You're aware of the path of all the work that needs to be done, but also taking into account the huge potential of Latin America for growth and to build a better future for everyone. Thank you very much, both of you. It was a huge pleasure. A round of applause, please.